I'm glad all of you are here. Thank you for coming. I'm going to start while we're waiting. I'm going to start passing around this clipboard. I'm going to be talking all about me today. Today's me. But I want to hear your stories too. So for those of you who want to, if you would put your name and your email address down, and then I will be sending you a few questions that are related to what I'm talking about. And anybody who wants to respond, this is totally voluntary. You can write your stories or pieces of your story and send it back to me. And then I'll know more about you, which might help inform, more what I talk about over the next few weeks. So again, totally voluntary, but if you want to share your stories with me, please put your email address. My second announcement, I'll go ahead and just start a little bit before Jace gets back, is to say I am not a historian. I am not a professor. I have never taught this before, which means all of you are my guinea pigs. So thanks for your sacrifice. I appreciate it. Next week we will not have this group, because something special is happening next week, and we want to save this time to help welcome Megan and her family back here. So then the second session will pick up in 2 weeks. And I think I might have heard that next Sunday is daylight savings time.
Yeah.
Is that right? Okay, so just a reminder to you. Just a reminder to you to spring forward.
No,
Or
I don't have anything next week.
right. And so I think those are the things that I wanted to share. So as we get started, David has agreed to open us in prayer.
May we pray? Lord, we do thank you for the opportunity to learn from our past and even to face those parts of our past that are not pleasant, parts that bring back memories of pain and hardship that sometimes we ourselves inflicted upon others. Guide Alicia as she speaks to us today. Bless this time together. In Christ's name.
Amen. Thank you. So, say a little bit about the bas-relief here in my picture. It was created by the sculptor Ed Hamilton, who is from Louisville, Kentucky. And the sculpture at least stood in today's environment. I hope it still stands at Lincoln Memorial Park in the waterfront in Louisville. And what this bas-relief represents is what we call a coffle of slaves. And we're going to be coming back to this word. And this is where they manacled and chained the enslaved people, often 2 by 2, to move them maybe from the slave jail to the dock, or actually long distance, sometimes for miles, to move them from one city or one town to another. So just going to hang on to that word, coffle.
You should be able to hit that there.
Do you think so?
Let's see.
There we go. All right. So we have some goals. These 3 goals will have the entire 6-week session. We have an emotional goal, which is that we'll be able to talk safely about the emotional challenges of race relations as we see them played out both historically and currently, systemically and personally. We have a historical goal of examining how and why the white church established and maintained slavery in the U.S. using Central Kentucky, where I'm from, as the microcosm of a greater experience. And then we have a theological goal to consider in what ways we, as the collective body of Christ, will live more like Jesus in our world after taking this journey together. Our particular goal for this session is for you, for all of us, to think about moments when we were white blind. If you ever were, I certainly was, and we'll be hearing about that today. And also events that moved you to become white awake. And this is something that we often take for granted. And I'm hoping the goal that we think more about these things as a result of being together. I know that a lot of you, maybe all of you, by now are very wide awake, which is good for me, as Tom and I were talking, that it gives me a safe place to try this out with a group of safe people, so I'm excited about that.
You're here for you.
So I'm going to be using two different analogies over the course of today. So the first one is to think about the idea of being in water. So I have a little story. So we have a little fish who's swimming along in, say, an ocean or a lake, and a second fish swims up to him and says, "So, hey, how's the water today?" And there's a little bit of a pause, and then the second fish says, "What is water?" And it's this idea that we can live totally in an environment, in an event, in a situation, and be absolutely unaware of it. This is why counselors are in business, because we go to them and they help us see the greater situation that we're in that we're not even aware of. This is why the very best comedians make their money, is because they are able to help us see not only the water that we're swimming in, but all the quirky ways that we adjust to the water that we don't even know we're in. And they make us laugh because of it. So we're going to be talking first, the first half, about this environment of white blindness that we're swimming in, and particularly looking at my story of white blindness. So today is me telling my story so you get to know me better, but telling it in a way I've never told it before, which is through the lens of whiteness. Now, nobody's story starts just with them. We all are products of what came before. So this is a 5-generation photo of my family. This is my great-grandmother, Josephine Hatchell. Next to her is one of her 4 daughters, my grandmother, Myrtle Hatchell Heisel. This is my mother, who's one of my grandmother's 4 daughters, Norma Jo Heisel May. That's me when I was 27. And then on my lap is my firstborn son, James, who was 4 months old in this picture. So what I wanted to point out in this picture is that my great-grandmother, I knew her and interacted with her often until I was 30 years old when she passed away. Her grandparents were young adults during the Civil War. Her parents were born after the Civil War. And so that means for 30 years of my life, I had direct connection with someone who had direct connection from the Civil War era. So I don't remember talking to her about the Civil War or anything, but it's just so easy to see how attitudes, behaviors, prejudices, long-held resentments could have been passed directly from them to her and from her to me. So the gap, what we think of history, is really quite small and definitely still affects us today. I'm going to be talking just a little bit about counties in Kentucky, and I just wanted to put this up to show you there's 120 counties in Kentucky. So when I talk about counties, I'm not talking about Spokane County and how, you know how big it is. This is what it looks like when I talk about Kentucky counties. This is a little bit of an easier map that I pulled up. I thought it was fun. It's an old souvenir map. So I'm from Lexington, where the yellow line is. This a snapshot from 1960. In 1960, Lexington, 15% of the population were African American. 1960. I was born in 1957. 1960, 15% African American. My grandmother, mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother that you saw in the picture were all from Harrodsburg, which is where the blue line is. In 1960, they had a 6% population of African Americans. Statewide, the average was 7%. So 6%. Over in the very far right, the very eastern part of Kentucky, that's where my dad's from. So eastern Kentucky is Appalachian Mountains. My dad grew up dominated with Appalachian Mountains and coal companies. So he's from Pike County. 0.8% population black people in Pike County. That's going to make a difference later in my story. So hang on to that fact. I wanted to start my journey with my grandmother, who you've met in that picture. This was my grandmother's house. I don't know when they moved in, but they were living there when I was born. They were living there when they died. They took in 2 of my cousins when they were 3 and 1 years old, and they raised them as their own children. And my oldest cousin still lives in this house. I got this off the internet, but that's my cousin's car. So, my grandparents were in their mid-40s when I was born, so they were both still working. They had these 2 young children, my cousins, that they were rearing. My brother and I were here a lot, visiting. So to keep things going, they had a black housekeeper, maid, babysitter named Lucille. And for the first 8 years of my life, Lucille was the only black person who I knew. And I had, good memories of her, good relationships there. But you would have to say that's a pretty limited knowledge of black people. The most important memory that I have related to Lucille has to do with one day my grandfather took her home. Usually she rode the bus, but sometimes for different reasons he would either go pick her up or take her home. And I just happened to be there one day when he was taking Lucille home. So this is my grandparents' house. This is my house that I grew up in. The shutters were not red and the door was not yellow, but this is my house. I lived here from 3rd grade until after I finished grad school the first time when I got a master's in special education. So that was my grandparents' house. This was our house. This is what Lucille's house looked like. This is probably not her exact house, but this is from a black neighborhood in Lexington. These were what's called shotgun houses. There was a room in the front, a room in the center, there's a kitchen, and then there was an outhouse. And even at 5 years old, when we pulled up in front of this house, I knew something was wrong. And after Lucille got out of the car, I asked my grandfather why Lucille didn't live in a house like ours. And he said, well, different people live in different kinds of houses. And even at 5, just like I knew there was something wrong, I knew I wasn't getting a straight answer from my grandfather. But what I learned that day was, whatever this was, the grown-ups didn't want to talk about it. And if the grown-ups didn't want to talk about it, I shouldn't talk about it either. So that is my first memory related to being white blind. That whatever this is, you don't talk about it. So this is just a quick map from 1938 showing what was Lexington then. The areas in red were the areas redlined for the black people to live. And you can see that on this is from a brochure, the red areas were marked as hazardous investments. This was a very common brochure for the era. And I suspect that the house I showed you was from this neighborhood. I don't know where Lucille lived, but I'm pretty sure the house was from here. So Lucille moved. So that was my introduction to the world of race. In 3rd grade, my mom took us to the dentist. The dental hygienist was a black man, which I remember, partly because he was very funny, but also because when he wanted to check my teeth, I looked at my mom to see if it was okay for me to open my mouth, because I didn't know if his blackness would rub off the black in my mouth, and I wanted to make sure it was okay. In 4th grade, there was a girl named Billy, a black girl named Billy, in my 4th grade class. She was the only black student that I went to school with from 1st grade to 9th grade. I have no memories of playing with her. I have no memories of doing a school project with her. I wasn't mean to her, but I wasn't friends with her. And all I could think now as an adult was she must have been really lonely. But no one talked about the fact that Billy might be lonely and encouraged any of us to play with her. We were swimming in white blindness. In 7th grade, I joined Southern Baptist Church, and you'll be hearing a lot about Southern Baptist churches as we get going. But let me just say, that is not where you're going to learn about diversity. And then in 9th grade, my civics teacher was a black man. He was, to this day, the only black male teacher I have ever had. So that brings us to high school. This is the front of the main building of my high school, Lafayette High School. There were multiple buildings even then, and it looks like a junior college campus now. Lafayette, I think it opened in the 1930s and was completely segregated until 1955. From there until mid-1960s, not very many black students. In 1963, the all-black high school in the county was closed. And then in 1967, the city schools and the county schools merged. And at that point, a lot of black students got bused to Lafayette. And that's about when I was in junior high school. And it was really, I guess, turbulent because my parents were wondering whether they were going to have to send me to a private school just because of whatever was happening there. But by the time I got to high school age, things had settled down enough that I went to Lafayette. So this is the picture page from my senior yearbook page. And you can see there's 16 students and 4 of them are black, just on this page. So integrated, right? Right? Well, I'll tell you some things I noticed when I was at Lafayette. First, all of the black kids' lockers were in the same hall. I don't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just telling you, somebody made the choice to put all the black kids' lockers in the same hall. There was a hall that I never walked down and never saw a white kid walk down because it was the black kids' hall. But even while this was true, and first I should say, there were almost 2,000 kids in my high school. So if you think, even a quarter of them are black, that's a pretty good number of kids, right? In all of my college prep classes, very high academic classes, one black girl in one class. All of the academic classes. I had some, very diverse art class, driver's ed. But in my senior year, I knew I was going on to become an elementary ed major, so I wanted to sign up for early childhood education. Sounds good, right? My counselor turned me down. Went to her office and said, I need you to explain to me why, as an elementary ed major, I can't get into early childhood education. She tried to divert me, but never could give me a straight answer, so I finally got enrolled. I walked in the first day, black female teacher, the only black female teacher I've ever had to this day. The whole class was girls, which is not unexpected. 75% of them were black, and 2 of them were pregnant. You can imagine how swoon that felt. But by the time that class was over, I started thinking, you know what? A lot of these girls are just as smart as I am. I wonder why they're not in my other classes. But I never asked, and nobody ever said, and I just kind of left, and life went on. So my question to you is, was my high school integrated? Well, on paper, yes. But in reality, no. They were still segregating the white kids and the black kids. And that was my experience. I had a very white, blind high school experience. I went on to college at the University of Kentucky, right there in Lexington. Very white classes. A couple of stories I want to talk about. It was my first time experiencing really blatant racism, which is I had a sorority sister who was from Louisville. She drove around with a gun in her car because someday a black person might attack her and she might need to shoot them. She had never been attacked. No one in her family had been attacked. But she had her gun. She would start on these rants, and I would have to say, I would try to divert her, but I never once said to her, what you're saying is wrong. Because she just didn't talk about it. Then, my dad, who's from Eastern Kentucky, 0.8% black population in his county. That's my dad, obviously older. He came out of the mountains. He was first generation to go to college from mountain people. It took a lot for him to do that. It was a big accomplishment. He went on and became a very successful civil engineer. He didn't talk about it much, but he was very racist. And that's our house on the right up there. Our beloved neighbors, John and Mary Lewis, moved when I was in college to go be with their daughter. And a black family moved in next door to us. A black family with 4 children moved in next door to us. And one day, my father made a racist comment that I will not repeat to you about them having 4 children. And I was really stunned. But I didn't challenge him on his racism, but I did have the presence of mind to remind him that 2 doors down from us, in the other direction, lived a Catholic family with 4 white children.
How many brothers and sisters do you have?
I have 9. 4 white children who had lived there as long as we had. And he looked very uncomfortable, and he actually said something like, well, it's not the same thing. And that was the end of our conversation. Again, why? Because you don't talk about it. The second story I will tell about my dad, again, and I loved my father dearly, but when I was in college, now about a senior, I ran with a circle of friends from Campus Crusade for Christ. And two of those young men were in ROTC, ROTC. And ROTC had a dance, and one of them asked me to be his date. And he was black. And I said yes, because he was my friend. There was no way I was not going to do this. But I had to go home and have that conversation with my father. And he tried to talk me out of it. And I said, no, this is my friend. I'm going to do this. So my father was so upset, he actually left the house so he would not be home to see a black person coming to pick me up for a date. Wow. It was such a struggle for him to even think about it. And we never talked about it again afterwards. So I went on to grad school on the special ed program. I had a graduate assistantship. The administrative assistant in the program, her name was Dolores, a black woman, and her boyfriend Toby. And I got to be friends with Dolores within the working aspect. But one time they did invite me to go to a nightclub with them, and which I did. And it was a little odd because most of the people were black when I walked in. And it was just a little weird, but I had a wonderful time. It was just so much fun. And then after I graduated, I started teaching. I was teaching in a very upper economic white neighborhood, but of course the magic of busing, they bused black children in. And so we had not only the white and black disparity, but you had the very high economic white and very low economic black, with some middle class white and black kids in the middle. So I taught for 5 years, and towards the end of that teaching time, I had a date that I want to tell you about that will wrap up the first part of the presentation. So on February 24th, 1983, Dale Jones invited me to go see Diana Ross at Rupp Arena in Lexington, Kentucky. So we parked the car several blocks away, and we're walking towards the arena, and I'm watching all the people walk, and I finally said, you know, didn't it seem like there's a lot of black people here? And he goes, yeah, I was thinking the same thing. And we walked a couple of more blocks until we started laughing. Because, I mean, seriously, how white blind do you have to be not to think there's going to be black people? And neither one of us at all expected it.
Wow.
Didn't even cross our minds. And when we were in this big arena, which was probably at least 50%, if not more, black people, again, I had that moment of, I have 2 experiences of being in the minority. One in that class, well, I guess 3, the class, the nightclub, and then now in this huge arena. And it was just lovely. It was so much fun. But it was a moment that jarred me, because usually I'm in the majority. I'm usually in the position of being able to be white blind. So I want to switch now from using the water as my analogy to using an analogy of a windshield. So this is my white blind windshield. Okay, you with me? I can only see through it through my whiteness. And I'm going to take you on a very quick journey from 1983 up to 2012. So from 1983, a year later from that date, and this is a story that we're not getting into today, I married a completely other person who was a wheat farmer from eastern Washington. And I moved from Kentucky to Colfax, Washington to become a wheat farmer's wife. My husband was and is a very staunch Republican. The entire county, as you probably know, is very red except for Pullman. Very red, very conservative. The churches are the same, and I was completely bought into all of it at that time. I had 2 children, my oldest son, James, who you saw as a baby, and then I have a second son, but my younger son is transgender. So in all of his growing up years, he was presenting as female. I stayed with my first husband until 2000. We got divorced, and I went to work at Washington State University as a fundraiser, first on the Pullman campus, and then eventually I moved up here to Spokane, worked off the Spokane campus. I stayed with WSU until 2012, and I went to work for a very small, little, interesting nonprofit here in Spokane called Priority Spokane. And the priority that we were working on at that time was to raise the graduation rate in Spokane. Across the county, but in particular schools really had problems. And the way that we were doing this was by pulling social service agencies together, pulling the school districts together, pulling businesses. I thought it was fabulous. And all these amazing, talented people all coming together, looking at the data. What can we do? Where is the money best spent? It just seemed like a wonderful idea. It was a wonderful idea. But we had one lone voice in the crowd. It was a Native individual, a two-spirit person, so non-binary person, who meeting after meeting would stand up and just in impassioned tones, sometimes so angry, sometimes crying, literally crying, so frustrated at what we were doing. And this person would say, "None of you even live in these neighborhoods. There are no teachers here. There are no students here. They haven't been given time off from school to even come. The only school representatives we have are the administrators, either of the school or from the school district. No parents have been invited to this meeting. No one else in those neighborhoods is here. If they had been, no transportation would have been provided or transportation vouchers for them to get here. All of you, almost everybody in the room was white. There were very few non-white, but the neighborhoods we're talking about were very diverse in terms of race and ethnicity and economics. And they would just say, there is no way that all of you, from your white, middle class, highly educated backgrounds, are going to be able to interpret the spreadsheets and the reports and the numbers that you're looking at so closely. You are never going to be able to interpret them correctly and come out with outcomes that actually help these people. You're going to do more damage than good." So in essence, she was accusing us of being the dogs around this table. the meeting of the Feline Healthcare Association. A whole bunch of people making decisions for another group not represented whatsoever. And this was the first time in my life that I was introduced to the idea that middle-class, educated, white people don't have all the answers for everyone. It had never occurred to me before. And this was like, you know how when you're driving and that little rock hits your windshield? That little chip, just that little chip. Doesn't go all the way through, but you can see it. Chipped my windshield. Okay. So then, after oh yeah,
So he said that at every meeting
every meeting.
and nothing happened.
Wow. So courageous. I just want to say just the sheer courage of that individual to keep speaking up. And other people were grumbling. There were a lot of grumbles. I myself wasn't offended. I just thought it was curious. It became the chip in my windshield. So I worked there until 2015, and then I went back into teaching. So I was teaching again in the resource room in the fall of 2016. Can we all remember the fall of 2016? And I had a black girl in 6th grade who, very smart, super smart, didn't like doing her work at all. So she got invited to come to my room during lunch so that as soon as she finished eating, she could finish her work. So she was sitting there eating in my room, and then out of the blue, she said, "Miss May, I'm really worried." And I was like, "Honey, like, what are you worried about?" And she said, "Donald Trump is running for president, and he doesn't like black people. And I'm worried that he's going to kill me because I'm black." And I felt in that moment, even though I really wasn't very aware that she not only wanted reassurance, but that she wanted reassurance from a white person. That this might not happen, or would hopefully not happen. And I'm weighing in my head how to be honest and how to give reassurance at the same time. And I said, "You are absolutely correct. There's a good chance that he will win, and he doesn't like black people. But I do not think that he has the power to just start killing black people. But I also want you to know there's a lot of people with skin like mine." Stand up. And I'm one of them. And that was my first time hearing a black person talk about harm that they expected to have happen to them simply for being black. 6th grade. And that was like a much bigger stone hit that little chip on my windshield. So that was fall of 2016. In 2018, I was still teaching. I started the Master of Theology program at Whitworth. And I also met the man who's now my husband, Jim. In the fall of 2019, Jim and his son Greg and I went to visit families, his in Iowa and Wisconsin, and then we came to Lexington so they could meet my family. And while we were in Lexington, I took them to visit the Shaker village of Pleasant Hill, or we call Shakertown. The Shakers were a very interesting religious sect that really blossomed during the 1800s. It would be fun someday just to do a study on the Shakers. But their little village has been restored and turned into a tourist area. They have a fabulous restaurant I highly recommend. But I had been here many times, right, many times. So I'm here with Jim and Greg, and we're going around, and the guide's talking, and he points to a road over on the perimeter, and he's like, oh yeah, that's old highway, whatever, up from Harrodsburg, where my mom's from. That's where they used to bring the slave couples up to market in Lexington. And I went, wait, what? What did you just say? The coffle is where they would chain the slaves together 2 by 2 with manacles and walk them. And he said, oh yes, like everybody should know this. We go, oh yes, it is written in some of their journals where the people of Shakertown observed the coffles being walked by up to the market in Lexington. And I'm thinking, that didn't happen. I was brought up in Lexington. I had history in high school. I got a B in Kentucky history. Never heard about this. This didn't happen. But while he's going on and we're walking around the buildings, it just kind of crept in my mind. Well, you know, downtown, that street that's right next to the old courthouse, it's called Market Street. And I got a really sinking feeling in my stomach. And then when we left and I was able to start looking things up, I learned for the first time that Lexington had been one of the biggest slave markets in Kentucky, and in fact in the South. I had not known that at all. And learning about the history, that even that much, that there had been slave trading in Lexington, began to crack the white blindness that I had. So that was in fall of 2019. And then, do we all remember 2020? 2020 was when COVID hit. And 2 things happened for me simultaneously. One, we're in enforced isolation. So because I couldn't do other things, I paid more attention to the news than I ever had before. And what was coming across the news were black people being killed. When you go to this website, SayEvery.name, it lists 40 different black people killed in 2020 alone. Ahmaud Arbery, killed by citizens from Georgia. We thought it was so funny that they filmed it. That's how we know about it. The ones marked with stars were all killed by law enforcement. Breonna Taylor was asleep in her bed. They were in the wrong apartment. George Floyd, we all know about George Floyd. David McCarthy, he was a food vendor. He had a food truck set up outside of where they were doing the Black Lives Matter protest. Police opened fire and he was killed. He wasn't even protesting. He was selling food. And I was hearing this. We were all hearing this. Every week it seemed like we were hearing of a new one. And I just was wrestling with God. And I thought, one day I had to stop. The white church could stop this. We could stop this. You ever seen the Hunger Games? I had me a Mockingjay moment. We could stop this, right? We can be the resistance. There's enough white Christians we can stop this. I lived in my happy moment for 2 days. And then I started to think, you know, if we were gonna stop it, we would have already stopped it by now, because this kind of thing has been going on a long time. Like, I mean, there were lynchings and there was slavery, and I didn't know much about those things, but I knew that they had happened. We could have already stopped it. And I lived in that moment for about 2 days. And then I had the moment that sealed it. We're not, only we haven't stopped it, we're responsible for it. It wouldn't have even existed in this country if it was not for the white church. And it just blew a huge hole in my white windshield. And I spent the next 3 years at Whitworth using every assignment that was given to me to wrestle with this intersection of history and theology, faith, the church, why the white church would allow this. And I was so obsessed with it that I finally had to write a thesis, which is what you're going to be hearing about over the next few weeks, on this intersection between the history and the white church. And I will tell you, it is no easy feat writing something that big, but I was driven by it. I was driven because it's so personal to me. And that's part of why I wanted to take this time to share my journey, so that you would understand how and why this is so personal to me, in addition to being historical and theological, you know, from the head point of view. In 2 weeks, we will be picking up with, I talked a lot faster than I thought I would. So we'll have more time for conversation. We'll be picking up with slavery in Kentucky. Now, I went through and I found some verses that I felt like were applicable to the topic here. So from Isaiah 42, and Isaiah 42 itself is a very special chapter in Isaiah. It says, "Hear, you deaf, and look, you blind, that you may see. Who is blind but my servant, and deaf as my messenger whom I send? Who is blind as my dedicated one, or blind as the servant of the Lord? He sees many things, but does not observe them. His ears are open, but he does not hear." So we're not talking about physical blindness there. It's directed to the religious, to the faithful. The faithful are the ones who are blind and deaf. Then we come to Matthew, and this is Jesus talking to the Pharisees. Matthew 23:24, "You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but swallow a camel." And again, who are the Pharisees? They are the religious. They are the leaders of the religious community, and they are the ones who are the blind. And then in Luke 4:18, this is Jesus is in the temple. He has read from the scroll to the men in the tabernacle, or in the, what am I trying to say? The synagogue. And then after he finishes reading, this is what he says. "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has appointed me. I always imagine him emphasizing that. He has appointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. So God is calling us to become white awake. He's calling us to have sight, to go from being the blind religious to being the awake. This is a journey, hopefully, that we'll all come back and that we can take together over the next few weeks. So, at this point, I wasn't sure how long this was going to take, so I would like to open the floor up now just for discussion and conversation. So, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Somebody be brave. Yes.
Well, my life experiences were very similar to yours. I grew up in a small town in northern Ohio, which was very segregated.
Yes.
You never saw any black people. And my parents were very racist, and I just accepted that as reality.
Yeah, this is what it is.
I had white blindness. Until I was 14 years old, when my family moved to a small town in the Bay Area, and it was called Alisa. I did not know it then, but it was in the Mexican-American burrito. Not Mexican.
Barrio.
Barrio, sorry. And when I got to the high school, it was almost all Chicanos. They called themselves Chicanos, Mexican-American, and I was in the minority. And I was subject to prejudice and harassment because I was white. And they called me names. They called me whitey. They called me all kinds of bad names. And I was so confused. Why would they do that? I was just shocked.
Yes.
And I would say, they would call me Okie. And I say, no, I'm not from Oklahoma, I'm from Ohio. It was a shock.
Yes.
Anyway, I was one of the smart white kids in the college prep program, and there were no Chicanos in that program. And I didn't understand, I didn't notice it at first as to why that was. That there were almost all the students were Chicanos, and there was no Chicanos in my classes. And finally, one of them did come to class. It was in my honors social studies class. But he didn't stay very long. And when he left, I asked the teacher, I said, why did Louise drop out? And he said, you'll have to ask him. So I saw him in the hall one day, and I said, Louise, why did you stop coming to class? And he just waved his hand and walked off. He didn't want to tell me. He probably didn't think I would understand. Anyway, and then I graduated and went to San Jose State University, which had also a large segment of Mexican American and other people. And I noticed again, there was no people of color in any of my college prep classes. And one day, I walked past a demonstration that was led by Mexican American people, and they were talking about how racist the educational system was. How about the Chicano students were channeled into classes that aren't college prep. And I thought about my high school, and I said, you know, these people are right. The system is racist. And I did not realize it at that time until then. And that's what radicalized me. Listening to his talk and realizing that I was living in white blindness, and it really opened up a new way of looking at things for me. And that's how I've become a radical.
Thank you for sharing that. And I noticed that your comment that the system was racist.
Yeah.
And that is a very important distinction, because many of us, I did, you grow up, if you think about racism at all, you just think it was like whether I was mean to you, whether I called you names, names, that's racism. But the entire system can be racist, and it just keeps perpetuating itself. Just-
I appreciate your story about priorities. Is that your
Priority Spokane.
Spokane? I had no idea about what this person was trying to tell all of you. I also would not have understood at all. But in about 2016 or so, we went to a conference with the Center for Action and Contemplation, and Christina Cleveland, who was a black woman, and we shared this with an adult editor with some of you, but she was saying so strongly that, and pointing out how in colleges and all kinds of places where they were trying to combat racism and show we want to be inclusive, etc., they would sit down to plan and there was not a black person at the table. And that how much you have to ask. But these are the people who know. These are the people who live it. They know what needs to change. And that was really an eye-opener for me. I like you say, I just couldn't, not even thought about it, and I would have gone right along with the way of doing it where you don't ask the people who are the very ones who are suffering from the prejudice and the system.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm listening to this and I'm thinking I'm almost kind of on the opposite side of this. My mother, her family were migrant workers and they traveled with cotton pickers across the South, fruit pickers. And in those days, we were considered white trash and worse than the blacks. And so my mother always just, there was no big deal about black people. But then my father was very, very racist. And all my life, I've had black friends and other friends who would have been, when we go to school, called the white trash kids. And it's just occurring to me now that this is probably why I never had any white friends. That here I am white, and most of my high school days, and even through my church history and stuff, I always was friends with all the black kids and the Indian kids and everybody else, and so I had very few white friends. I still have very few white friends.
It influences who we become, doesn't it? What our childhood and our growing years. Thank you for sharing. Marty?
Yeah, I grew up from age 2 to 9 in public housing in Seattle. And it was really set up for a lot for returns from the Second World War to the college. But there were it was called Rainier Vista. It later became one of the most dangerous places in Seattle. But I grew up and it was a very mixed population. And I just that was a great experience, and it carried with me through the rest of my life. I just didn't see, quite through the same lens that you did. But when I graduated high school in 1961, I went into the Army, and after basic training, I was sent to Georgia for advanced training. And I landed in Augusta, Georgia, where the beautiful golf course is. And the first stop, I was traveling by bus from Seattle all the way, was in Kentucky. I got off the bus in Kentucky, and there were the water fountains for whites and the water fountain for colored. And I thought, my God, I didn't, I knew about what was going on somewhat, but first time I saw it. I get to Augusta, and the first thing I noticed is we're walking through town, and the blacks would have to step off the sidewalk onto the street, so that the whites could walk on the sidewalk. And you knew right away they had better do that, or they're going to get beat up, put in jail. But as to your point about the church being a defender of what has gone on in many ways, there's a wonderful book called 400 souls. And it came out in 2019 in memory of 1619 when the first slaves arrived in our country. And there is an entry, each year gets an entry written often by someone who was black, and it was hard to find these because not many black people were writing for it. And it talked about something that happened to this black family who had taken in like a nephew and a niece. Their mother had died as a parent, and they were Christians. And they had been baptized, and so they wanted their children baptized. And this was a church, what I would call fairly progressive in our day and age. But they talked about what went on, and the church raised the issue up to the highest level of the church in the colonies at that time. And they determined if we baptize these children, they're Christian, and we have to treat them as Christian, but then we can't do that. What if enslaved blacks start wanting to be baptized? How are we going to handle this? And so here came this ruling after about 6 months of looking at this, of saying we will no longer baptize blacks in the country. Because if we did, we'd have to treat them as equal.
Children of God.
Yeah, and that was from Maryland. And, Maryland, just like Kentucky and Delaware at the time, were what they called the border states, where they had slavery. It was an issue that greatly influenced Lincoln. That's the start of the Civil War, not wanting those states to go to the South. Anyway, we have an amazing history in this country over the issue of how we treat black people. And it is without a doubt the greatest stain on our, it's one we've never resolved. We haven't resolved it yet.
Not yet,
And it
exactly.
keeps bubbling up.
And I just wanted to say before we close, I didn't pay Marty to say all that. It's a perfect preview to what's coming up. So thank you. Well, we're past time. So thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. And
So we're not going to meet next week?
we're not meeting next
There's going to be
week.
Kate and Megan.
Nate and Megan and daylight
Archie.
savings time. And then in 2 weeks, I'll see you again. So thank you for coming.